everybody. I'm Agnieszka Miguel. I'm the chair of electrical and computer engineering at Seattle University. And I'm also the chair of the ECEDHA diversity working group. And today it is my pleasure to introduce you to Bias Busters, an organization run by graduate students and mentored by staff and faculty at the University of California, Berkeley. Bias Busters was originally started in the electrical engineering and computer sciences department at UC Berkeley and modeled on similar organizations at Carnegie Mellon University and Google. Bias Busters' goal is to address implicit bias in their community and make the campus welcoming and inclusive to all. The events that they organize include workshops on implicit bias and bystander intervention, reading groups, and movie nights focus on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, speaker series, and a certification for those who want to be leaders in DI work. Today, we are joined by 5 members of the Bias Busters team. All of them are PhD students. We have Alexander Alvara from Mechanical Engineering, Nicole Marie Cotton from African American Studies, Kieran Polo from Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences, A.S. Robson from Computational Biology, Josh Sands from Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences. You can find more information about our speakers and Bias Busters on the ECEDHA Summit webpage. I'm sure you don't want to listen to me, but you would rather listen to our Bias Busters. So please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming Bias Busters.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So if you look in the chat, we are going to be sharing our slides with everyone. So if you can follow along with us. So as was mentioned before, we're the Bias Busters. You can go on to the next slide. And you already know who we are. So we were started in 2016 by a group of graduate students at UC Berkeley, inspired by the work done at Google and Carnegie Mellon University with bystander intervention and implicit bias. So we do presentations for faculty, pedagogy courses, graduate admissions, so that admissions are more fair process, faculty recruiting, undergrad organizations. We just presented at a high school that asked us to present, and you. We did a film screening of the film Coded Bias. I don't know if you all have seen that, but I highly recommend it. And we do speaker series. Next slide. So we want to start out, it's pretty early in the morning, depending on where you are, with the icebreaker, ice cream breaker. If you can use the link in the chat to fill out the poll, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? I know I am dairy free, so I like Ben & Jerry's dairy-free almond milk ice cream. So if you all can participate in the chat. Oh, someone asked in the chat, what is the name of the movie? It's Coded Bias. So you'll see your results in the up on the screen. Okay, and some people are responding in the chat. I saw a fudge brownie, that sounds great. So it looks like butter pecan is pretty popular. Chocolate is also very popular. All right, so I hope you're good and hungry this morning, and during lunch you'll have some ice cream inspired by the participants. All right, if we can go on to the next slide. So I'll be reviewing some important concepts that we will talk about in our presentation. Hopefully you all are oriented or familiar with these words, but we will be covering them more in depth in this presentation: historically underrepresented minorities, explicit versus implicit bias difference, imposter syndrome, intersectionality, and stereotype threat. So want to preface with the understanding that this is a safe learning space, and to assume good intentions. People do make mistakes when they speak. And if you do make a mistake, just rectify and move on. No one's going to judge you. We're all growing. Experimenting, as you know, is part of learning. So part of learning and remembering things is making mistakes. You will sometimes feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's where you grow. And to remember to speak from your personal experiences. They're valuable and people remember them. That's how people relate to you, with your personal experiences. Okay, explicit bias and environment. So we do want to hold space of what happened last week in Atlanta. And, it raised the issues of intersectionality of gender and race. Unfortunately, there is a history of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, and particularly in Canada or in California. So that's why we do have to celebrate diversity, inclusion, and hold space and remember the historical legacies of what's affecting us today. Also, we do want to remember that people around us might be suffering and disproportionately impacted by the current events. So we do want to support our colleagues that may be feeling more scared right now. So in 2020, there was a resurgence of anti-Asian sentiment because of the politicians using words like Wuhan virus and Chinese flu. There is some research that is indicated below of a study that was done in 2020, very timely, about how these sort of words reactivated the historical presence of anti-Asian sentiment. And of course, also what happened last year with COVID-19 was the awareness of Black Lives Matter, particularly because of the viral images of George Floyd. And more people are coming together and looking at issues of bias and racism in the United States. But also, we also have to remember that with these awareness of issues, people are feeling uncomfortable, and people are experiencing more mental health impacts because of feeling more scared or just uncomfortable about what their part is in society. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eyes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nicole. We're going to do another quick poll real fast, and we just want to check some questions about mental health in terms of how you have been able to support your students, maybe your peers if you don't work with students, in terms of helping individuals and specifically like reaching out to people. And so there is another link in the chat. Of course, you're welcome to mention comments in the chat about a sentence or two about things that you've been able to do or help, whether it's having additional check-ins or having a greater awareness of different issues and digging into some of them with your students. All right, so some of you have said checking in frequently. That's great. 24/7 availability. That can be great. Make sure that you take care of yourself too. More time to listen is great. Department town halls, absolutely. Town halls can be a really great way to set a collaborative and inclusive environment. Personal conversations, listening, yes. Wellness and self-care, absolutely, definitely emphasizing that and going above and beyond is great. Showing empathy, thank you, Pamela, in the chat. Some weekly individual contacts, a virtual space and gather can be pretty nice, yes. Lots of great ideas. I'm glad we're seeing some of this discussion. If you haven't been able, or if you haven't managed to be able to take some of these initiatives on your own, feel free to jot some of this down just in case you feel like you want to make a more helpful experience. And yeah, a lot of you I think are talking about making more time to chat. I do wonder in previous years where all that time came from, but okay. Emailing specific students, that's great, yeah, and definitely some being able to offer remote social activities, I think is a really good one. Okay, so I think that's most of what we'll go through on our polls, but thanks to all of our respondents. And one thing we like to talk about in Bias Busters is addressing and fixing the problem, not trying to say fix people. It's something we kind of see a little bit in tech culture where we like to avoid the topic. We like to talk about, oh, tech's a meritocracy, you know, just focus on getting work done. Don't worry about the small details or something like that. But there's a lot of issues that come up for different people, and ignoring those problems doesn't really solve it, especially for underrepresented minorities or when women and gender nonconforming individuals. They oftentimes have to deal with additional biases that we may not have to deal with if we aren't part of those groups. And so it's sometimes useful to have resiliency training and bystander intervention. So if you are working with a coworker or you have a student who might be dealing with some adverse issues or some microaggressions, it's really great for you to be able to stand up for them and to work on making a more inclusive environment. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So this kind of talks about some different issues and environmental effects. We can see different types of explicit or implicit bias. As Nicole talked about some of the explicit biases, most of what we focus on is implicit biases, but it's important to understand there's a connection. There's a direct connection between the two. So one such implicit bias could be something like stereotype threat, which could be when someone is perhaps not in a majority group within a larger group. They might experience some differentiating remarks. So if someone says something, it might single them out. It might make them feel uncomfortable. Some individuals might be experiencing something like imposter syndrome, which we'll talk about later, where they might not feel comfortable in a certain environment. And that's something that affects many of us in STEM. There's also a narrative of science geniuses. So there's this idea, like we like to talk about when we talk about things like Nobel Prizes or Turing Awards. And I think we have, if we're going to click forward a few times, we have a lot of these, famous people, many of whom you can recognize just from image alone. And we think of these people as like the big scientists of the world, but in reality, they were kind of normal people. And we have this past bias in that we have the survival issue of a different time when different people were and weren't allowed to do science. And so this is kind of can disproportionately impact people who may not have as much early exposure to STEM or who may not necessarily have the resources to exist in a very like well-trained environment. But these all really create barriers to entry, and it's something that we ask ourselves is how can we engineer our environment so that everyone is successful, not merely people who resemble the past and people who resemble historical patterns. So one thing we ask is if you are an ecologist, right, whether you're running a department or you're running a class, we think about it in the sense of maybe you have these three different environments where you've got, we've got a vertical line separating three different environments. And we can see that on the leftmost environment, we have a lot of healthy ducks. In the middle environment, we have a few ducks. On the right environment, we don't have any ducks. And sometimes we talk, oh, maybe the ducks need to try harder, right? If they're going to survive in the third environment, or maybe they have to do extra work, or maybe they have to get creative. But perhaps there's something fundamental about that environment that's not conducive to ducks living there, right? This is something that we observe in nature all the time, we don't go and say, oh, why can't these ducks live in Antarctica? That's just not where ducks live, right? It's not a conducive environment. And if we want to have a healthy population of ducks, maybe we need to change the environment or make adjustments that ensure that ducks will do well there. And so we'll go on to the next slide. So this brings us to some issues of barriers to entry. For those unfamiliar, this is just one of the ways that we think about filters that may adversely impact, whether it's explicit bias or implicit bias, filters that may adversely impact the type of people who are able to succeed in STEM. And so we can see there's some different barriers in high school, things like gatekeeping and knowledge keeping. So certain guidance counselors might not equally distribute information. There might be certain, student-to-student microaggressions. There's a lot of standardized testing, such as the SAT. Many of us think positively of this because we ourselves got really good scores on it. And we think, oh, it must be a useful, successful predictor of performance. But there's underlying a lot of like class issues. A lot of, wealthier, high-income individuals can afford to spend a lot more time studying for this or get personalized tutoring that other people don't necessarily have access to. And if we go into undergrad, we can see, these same similar patterns. So there's certain social burdens that might adversely impact people with mental health issues or self-esteem issues. There's obviously different like recruitment biases. So certain universities might target certain cities or populations and might exclude others. We can see different universities like HBCUs kind of take a stand against this and are dedicated to ensuring that there are underrepresented groups present in their STEM departments. But there's also different types of hidden opportunities. So maybe you need to have certain connections, right, to get a job or to get a certain REU. And that might be inaccessible to people who don't have parents in academia or who have parents who are engineers. And so these can all, add up. And moving on to the graduate level, certain research advisors might have preferences for people who are like them or people who have the same hobbies. And unfortunately, with gender roles, we have a lot of gendered hobbies, and that means that many of these biases may matriculate through systems. But again, we also have issues of recruitment. There's hidden opportunities that you may have difficulties getting funding unless you happen to have a friend who was funded and they happen to have different connections to other groups. And we can see in industry as well, there's a lot of similar problems. Certain industries might prioritize certain universities, and those universities might not be diverse. That just might be the way that the system is, but that doesn't mean that we can't try to change these environments. For instance, reducing harassment or identifying issues of unequal pay. There's lots of different opportunities to try to fundamentally shift the environment to be more inclusive, to be more accepting of others, and to ensure that we have healthy population of ducks in any area, whatever ducks means to you here. So we'll go on to our next slide, and that brings us to the concept of these different types of implicit biases. We've mentioned a few of them over the past few minutes, but we're going to get into some of the specifics of what these are, and we will have opportunities for more feedback. We'd certainly like to keep all of you in the loop. And so I am handing it off to Alexander, is that right?
To me.
And I think it's Josh. There we go.
Josh, my bad. Okay, sorry. Yes, we're here to Josh.
Okay, so implicit bias, which is also often called unconscious bias, is something that is built into all of us and comes from our unconscious brain taking shortcuts in thinking, using broad categories or generalizations in order to help us fit what we're observing into some model of the world. But as we know, no model is perfect. And unconscious bias can lead to outcomes that don't represent what we want and can lead to environments that are not conducive to everybody being successful. Unconscious bias is not inherently a bad thing. It's just a feature of how we think that we need to manage in order to create an equitable environment. And because it is unconscious, it's very hard to catch it in yourself. So we need to help each other observe these unconscious reactions or categorizations and point them out so that we can correct ourselves. Next slide. So some evidence of where unconscious bias can play out is that of American men, 15% are 6 feet tall or more, but almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet. And this mismatch becomes even more extreme when you set the cutoff to 6'2", where 4% of men are that tall, but 36% of CEOs are that tall or more. And this might make sense in a world where biases play into how we perceive tall people as being authoritative. But if you ask yourself, in a completely unbiased world, does being tall make somebody a better CEO? The answer is really no. It doesn't make you a better strategic thinker or more creative. So we're going to dive into some studies, in particular on letters of recommendation, because it's relatively well studied, and you can do some interesting linguistic analyses on them. But a lot of the features that show up in letters of recommendation are also reflected in other areas, like work evaluations or how people are evaluated. So in one study, there were letters of recommendation to a geoscience postdoc fellowship that were studied. And what the study found was that women were half as likely to receive an excellent letter compared to a good letter relative to men. And in another study of chemistry and biochemistry applications for faculty positions, more standout words were used. So standout words are things like excellent, superb, outstanding, unique. Ability words would be like talent, smart, ability, and grindstone words are something like hardworking, conscientious, diligent. And standout words were used for men more than women, and they were also paired with ability words rather than grindstone words. So this is reflecting a difference in perception of where men's success is coming from relative to women. Next slide. In another study that's a little bit older, for medical faculty positions, the letters for women were shorter and were less positive in general than letters for men. They only provided sort of a minimal assurance that this person would do okay in the position rather than that they would excel. Another difference is that the letters talked about personal lives for women compared to professional lives for men. And similar effects happened in psychology faculty letters, where letters for women had more doubt-raising statements. So they're just a less positive assurance. Some of those studies are a little bit older, but this is a phenomenon that continues to occur today. So in a more recent study, which ended, I guess, 2 years ago now, it was last year when we created this slide, for medical residencies, and I think radiation and oncology, the letters for interviewed applicants were significantly skewed in terms of standout words, which again are like excellent, superb, for white and Asian applicants relative to underrepresented minorities. And the effect here is a little bit interesting because the letters had already gone through a screening process to decide who would be invited to interview out of all of the applicants. So it's unclear whether this effect is coming from the letter writers or the letter readers. What we all have control over is how we read letters. So it's important to be really conscious of what the language that you observe is and how it affects how you view the applicant being discussed in the letters. And these biases in letters, are real, but even with completely unbiased letters, there are still unconscious biases that impact how we perceive an applicant. So in this study, there was an application docket for a generic applicant that was submitted to faculty with either a male name or a female name, and otherwise identical. And what the study found was that the male applicant was rated as more competent, more hireable, and a better mentor for a lab manager position, even though the content was exactly the same. And this played out even further with a difference in the starting salary that was offered to the applicant, which is, it's a real harm for female or other minority applicants. So we've seen some studies that deal with specifically male-female gender changes or like Asian and white versus underrepresented minority differences. But nobody's identity can be described as just male or female, just white or not white, just Midwestern or Middle Eastern. All of these identities interplay with each other, and which identity is cued can also have an impact on how people perform. So in this study, a group of, I think, high school females were asked to take a math test, and they were primed with a questionnaire that either asked about their Asian identity or their female identity, or questions related to neither identity. And the results found that when these participants were primed with their Asian identity, they performed better on a math test compared to a neutral or a female primed identity. So this is a phenomenon known as stereotype threat, where being primed with one of your identities can impact how you perform based on what stereotypes are associated with that identity. And one caveat here is that it might seem like, oh, great, we should remind everybody, Asians that they're Asian before they take a math test and they'll do better. But this can actually backfire because of the stress of expectations of performance, causing people to perform opposite to what the stereotype is. So in order to create like an inclusive classroom or environment, it's really better to avoid priming these stereotypes in the first place. All right, we're going to move on and talk about imposter syndrome.
Thank you, Josh. So with the next slide, we want to make sure that we understand what imposter syndrome is. Imposter syndrome can be loosely defined as doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud, or disproportionately it disproportionately affects high achieving people, people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments, or who might be misappropriating where their accomplishments are coming from. So this the idea that you're only succeeded due to your luck or because of your talent, not because of your talent or qualifications, is often another perception that's taken for imposter syndrome. And taken from the studies are some quotes from 1978. It hasn't changed much since then. The concept of imposter syndrome, the feeling of not being able to live up to expectations. Some of these I'll go ahead and read off. I'm not smart enough for computer science. I got lucky on that test. I got lucky and got into Cal. So these are again referencing specifically to Cal. I test well, but I'm not actually smart. Lower down the line, we see I shouldn't even attempt this extra credit homework question because it's too hard, or I should stop going to my study group because I'm slowing them down. And a lot of these can end up persevering as we continue down the line. What we end up seeing is that students are taking imposter syndrome and moving through different phases of their education. This is again pervasive in all people. A lot of times, as the diagram indicates, people tend to think that their knowledge is a smaller subset of the person next to them's knowledge. Their knowledge is a smaller subset of the people around them, and that everyone around them knows and has gone through more and can perceive better the things that they're going through. When in reality, it's towards the right, where we see that people have overlaps in knowledge. People around us know similar amounts of things and relative to our experiences. And a lot of times these differences in knowledge or differences in understanding can skew the way we see ourselves, because we see someone else having knowledge outside of our field or outside of our understanding or outside of our wheelhouse. And one important thing to understand is that no one is immune from imposter syndrome. Research shows that 70% of people will experience it at some point. And so statistically speaking, people in this room, as you're all high achieving members of society, will have experienced this throughout your life. As such, we want to go ahead and take an imposter syndrome poll real quick to just kind of get some feedback from y'all. You can use the QR code, or you can refer to the link in the chat. Here we go. And just take a moment to answer the questions in the form so we can kind of gauge the impact that it's having, even in this room. And while we do that, we'll show some kitties, a live cam from the kitten rescue.
This is an LA shelter, yeah. So
Nice. Thank you, Kieran.
yeah, a little something to watch after you're done with the poll. The link is in the chat, just a reminder.
Tim, we can certainly try, but I myself would like one of those kittens. So
I call dibs on the one that's eating. They're so active.
all right, just a few more seconds if people have anything to submit. Okay, we're ready.
Thank you, guys. Okay. So just as I expect, some of us do experience imposter syndrome. Some of us do think that, so in the upper left-hand corner, we can see that approximately 40% of us in the room feel that our peers experience imposter syndrome. whereas it's actually something like 66% of us that do still experience imposter syndrome. So looking at the students at the bottom pie chart, do you feel that your students in your department think you experience imposter syndrome? And so perception here is that almost half of you think that your students do not think that you have imposter syndrome. That's an important takeaway. So this can give some purview into like how each of us are going through our lives and how we are impacting the people around us. It may very well be that more students do not perceive you as having imposter syndrome, but expressing that understanding, expressing that you still go through it, can alleviate some of their own imposter syndrome, realizing that the people around them who are high achieving, who have gone to places where they are considering exemplifying, who have gone to places where they are looking up to, are still experiencing this, can bring a sense of reality check into their own perspective. That not only is it something that you have to continually work with, but it's not just you, it's other people, and it's even high achieving people. And so this can give, again, a reality check, a sanity check, if you will, for some of these perspectives. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So we want to acknowledge that diversity is intersectional. We want to acknowledge the dimensions in which diversity lives. Not only is it race, not only is it a gender identity, not only is it an ableist perspective, but sorry, an ability versus having a person who might have a disability, but everyone has intersectionalities. On top of that, these intersectionalities have different layers of experience and how they go through life. So we want to acknowledge that our experiences are unique. We can't just generalize from our perspective, because that's unfortunately what it will only ever be, is our perspective. Even if we take into account other people's group-minded, we may not be able to capture the cultural backgrounds and the ways in which other people have grown up. So this might bring into this. I want to bring it into the conversation the EMIC versus the EDIC approach to intersectionality. So it's likened to the linguistic study of cultures, often brought up in archaeology. Specifically, EDIC refers to the research that studies across cultural differences, where EMIC refers to research that fully studies one culture, or maybe sometimes a secondary culture, with no or very little cross-cultural focus. So it's the idea that the EDIC refers to like looking from within a social group, like me looking from within a Latinx male, cis male perspective and the culture that I grew up in, versus me looking out into, say, someone who's a differently abled, maybe Black, LGBTQ perspective. I do not understand their cultural background, and so I have an outsider's view. And acknowledging that we all oftentimes try to generalize to other people's social groups can be a good way to self-check. Being conscious that we have an EDIC understanding of other people's lives can sometimes be a good self-check to how you're approaching what other people should be doing and can be doing. If you take the next slide, please. I want to start taking this and using it to give you some tools for combating bias. So we're going to kind of focus down. We're going to narrow down here just for the sake of time. We want to go ahead and focus on personal acts here, things that you can do, take from today to act as an ally to mitigate the effects of bias. And there are other things that we'll talk about later that you can do departmentally, that you can do from a program stance. And these are, again, going to be suggestions of best practices that we've seen work. So coming back and bringing it back down to this more of a narrow viewpoint of what things a person can do. You can definitely act as an ally. So recognize that although you may want to affiliate yourselves, or maybe you want to be more understanding of people from the minority perspective, some of us are not from that perspective, and some of us are want to be able to understand that you can speak up for these people, you can act as an ally. And so parts of that are again, recognizing and being self-aware if you're in an uncomfortable situation, and ask yourself why. These conversations need to become normalized, and the only way that that's going to happen is if we address the part that's making us uncomfortable. And so from a personal perspective, just sitting with yourself and understanding and maybe talking with someone and going through the things that make you uncomfortable and really kind of diving into what the subconscious, potentially subconscious reasons are. Practicing bystander intervention is an important one. A lot of times these minoritized groups are being, if and when they're being harassed, people tend to take the bystander approach. They just look, or they pull out their phones or something. And while that's important, documenting cases of harassment, cases of interaction that may have a later consequence are important. It is important to do that. Also stepping in and letting the harasser, the person that's performing maybe the microaggression, understand that that's not acceptable in this space. Understand that those types of actions are not going to be tolerated. That can kind of also allow those who are maybe performing the microaggression to understand, oh, I'm doing something wrong here. I need to recheck. I need to recalibrate. And so again, I want to make sure that we understand that these are some of the personal things that you can take from here. We want to definitely recognize our power. Again, coming from my majority group, most predominantly white institutions have a majority white, Asian, or international student body. And this is even more true in the electrical engineering and computer sciences. So recognizing that these majority groups have power. Not only are you as a dean or a chair or a head of your department, someone who sits in a place of power, but on top of that, you might or may not be a faculty member or a staff member. And so you sit in these places of power where people listen to you and the students look up to you. And so realizing that and taking taking the initiative to attend and advertise. In other words, showing up to different events with the groups that you're seeking to help affiliate yourself with. Advertise, speaking out for them, advocating for them when they're not in the room. These things are going to set an example for those who are watching you, which are, again, more than likely a majority of students on your campus. We want to place value on the work beyond research. So this is important because a lot of times in history and even in current day, people tend to say that DEI work is not real work. People tend to say that the work that you do outside of your research is not a real contribution scientifically. We want to push back on that. We want to recognize that the scientist influences the science. And although it is true that the opposite occurs, more often than not, a scientist who's creating the concepts, who's developing the theories to test a thing or to create a device are going to influence their science. And so recognizing what parts of your bias are being infused into this science, what parts of your understanding from your own cultural background are going to be imparted into this is definitely an important part of research. And again, we want to keep on saying this, we want to normalize the conversation. Again, these things are going to be difficult, and that's the point. It'd be easier to settle into our positions of power and never think about the things that make us uncomfortable again. But again, that's something that's a privileged standpoint. Those of us who are not in a position of power have to live with the consequences of those that are in power. We want to make sure that we set clear and consistent expectations. A lot of times, sitting in a position of power, you know what you want, but the people around you may not understand what that is. And so making sure that you explain to them what these expectations are going to be very important. And so again, this harkens back to speaking up for other people. So next slide, please. So I know we've mentioned this before, but inclusion definitely needs advocates. So the non-dominant group members can speak up for themselves. but they're fewer. So if I'm statistically speaking, if I'm in my whole department and I'm the only one talking about this, there's going to be very few people who hear me if other people are talking about other things. So if we can get the dominant group to speak up and help and become allies and advocates, then we may be heard. So it is very much the case that non-dominant groups members are not able to speak up for themselves because they're either subconsciously suppressed or not heard. They experience bias more frequently and so don't have the energy to keep on speaking up for themselves. And even if when they do, they still might not be heard because they're so few. So when you're in the majority situation, you have the best opportunity to step in as an ally. You are in a position where you have less to lose. And so sticking your neck out is not as difficult as if it were for a minority student or a minority member of the faculty or otherwise. And so we want to be able to bring them into the fold and speak up for them and protect them when things are definitely turning for the worse. And so we want to look at inclusion within your own research group. So definitely want to focus in on what your own research group looks like. A lot of times the department may be statistically trending towards parity within demographics of, say, the state or the nation, but within groups, that small group may be of one specific background or cultural or otherwise. And so taking that into account can be useful. And again, we definitely want to bring this up again. We can all be advocates. Each of us needs to decide if, how, and when intervening might be appropriate. Next slide, please. So I think I'm going to pass it off to Kieran.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexander. So we've just kind of dumped a lot of information on you, some which may be familiar, some which may be new to you, and that's okay. We're all learning here. And a big part of this learning experience is actually putting these concepts into practice. And a big part of it is seeing how we feel in these scenarios. And so what we like to do here at Bias Busters is go into breakout rooms, and we're going to look at some of these scenarios, and we're going to talk about not only how we feel about the scenarios or how we might evaluate the scenarios, but we're also going to practice what we call bystander intervention. And so it's very, it's one thing to see something and tell yourself that's not okay. Clearly that person has some biases. It's another thing entirely to actually intervene and use language to diffuse a situation and act as an advocate and act as an ally for those who might need you to. And so that language is, not something that necessarily comes intuitively. It's something that is a muscle that needs to be practiced and worked on. And so what we like to do in these scenarios is come up with this specific language, talk about what you would actually say in the situation, not just how you might feel about it, but what you would do in that scenario. And so the first scenario here, I'm going to share with you, but also let's, make sure that everyone has access to these slides in case you want to keep following along after we go to breakout rooms. I put the link in the chat a couple of times, so hopefully you can go back and find that. And so we're going to go into breakout rooms now. Ideally, each one should have a moderator, but really we want you to read through the scenario. We've come up with some kind of prompts or questions you can start out with, but I encourage you to ask more questions and go beyond these prompts if you like. And then please designate someone, at least one person from your group, to share back. So we're going to come back to this main room after we go over the first scenario, and we will share our thoughts, and then we'll go into the second scenario. Okay. So thank you for those who are helping us moderate. If the host would like to open breakout rooms, that would be a huge help. And we are going to spend maybe 7-8 minutes and discuss. And remember to designate someone to share back with the group so we can all kind of get our ideas together. I'll wait a moment and see if anyone else, I think everyone's back in the main room now. So hopefully you all had some interesting, insightful discussions. I know my room was, breakout room had some great discussion. And I guess first off, does anyone want to share anything they talked about in their room, whether it's anything regarding this scenario?
One thing that we talked about in our room was that it really depends on a lot of situations. That if Alex has told you privately their preference, you may not want to rat them out, so to speak, in the larger group. Or is this a ongoing problem that if it is, you may want to talk to Dr. Connie individually, or figure out another way of calling Dr. Connie in to not do it anymore?
Definitely. Yeah, you were in my room, and yeah, it was great that we looked at, the different ways in which we can make people comfortable, right? And so we can try and address it less directly by just using they them pronouns, or we could just rectify it later, or we could rectify it right there in the moment. And each of those approaches has its pros and cons. Other thoughts?
Well, one of the things that came out in our group that I thought was really kind of an excellent way to handle this kind of thing is to set the stage early on. So at some point, Alex, the new faculty hire, had this conversation with you about their desired pronouns. At that point, it might be a good time to ask Alex how they might want to confront the situation if somebody doesn't, consider their preferences in conversation. So, having that conversation in a temperate moment rather than in the moment later on when we're all trying to figure out what do we do with this thing that's confronting us, might be a good way to handle it. So I thought that was just really, that wasn't my idea, but it was, I think, really quite a good one.
Yeah, that's why we're here, because everyone has great ideas, and it's great to hear what they have to say. That's a great point. It goes kind of back to something we mentioned earlier that we can do is setting clear and consistent expectations. In general, establishing those with people is the best way to create an equitable environment where everyone feels understood and safe. Thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts? Any other? Yeah, thank you for raising your hand, Mario. Feel free to just chime in. You don't have to raise your hand. Or maybe that was an accidental hand raise. But if anyone else wants to chime in, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't unmute. It was the clicking of the buttons. So thank you for calling. I appreciate it. Agnieszka was the sponsor for our group, so I'll let her speak to her group. But it just occurred to me through this conversation, what if Dr. Connie's the one feeling uncomfortable using the other pronouns? We have some very conservative people, and I could see them feeling very uncomfortable being put into this position. Would it make sense to have Alex and Dr. Connie have a conversation about it, or what? So I'm just wondering about the other side of the conversation as well.
I have a comment about the way I see everything falling out. It feels as if a lot of the conversation right now is about the comfortability of the ones in power. That's a common theme. I just want to highlight that's the theme.
Yes,
right now.
I agree. I was to answer, tough luck. Get used to it. This is different life now, and catch up. One of our bases for our job is lifelong learning. This is part of lifelong learning and improving yourself. So I'll say I have no, I have no tolerance for people like that. But I think one thing that we talked, since you called me as the moderator of our group, we talked about establishing rules at the very beginning, starting a meeting with saying, we don't know each other that well. Let's, everybody introduces themselves, and please include pronouns and call them back if they haven't included pronouns. And so I think that was one of the themes we had. And we talked about talking to Dr. Connie privately. I raised the question of if it was a group of students, I would like to show the students that I'm addressing it. I wouldn't want to talk privately only to the student, but also somehow show them that this is an inclusive classroom. And so establishing those rules, showing that you care so everybody feels safe and included.
I thank you so much for those comments. I couldn't have responded better myself. Definitely, that was it's really important to. I mean, I appreciate your insight, Mario, because I mean we're at UC Berkeley. We're in the Bay Area. It's pretty liberal, and it's important to keep in mind that these conversations may go differently depending on the parties that are involved. But Shayla and Agnieszka really bring up a good point in that, this is, we're examining the different dynamics here and the power dynamics. And it's important that we do not compromise the comfort of those who are not in power just to make those in power comfortable. So while it's important to be diplomatic in a sense, keep in mind those power dynamics in all of these situations, I think, is the takeaway. And as Agnieszka explained, again, setting those expectations is really, really key. So there's some great sharing going on. I don't want to cut anyone off if anyone else would like to share as well. We do have another scenario. I think it might be good to get in there. I'm excited to hear people's thoughts. So again, we're going to go into breakout rooms. Here is the...
Sorry, I think Susan had her hand up real quick.
Oh, I totally missed that. I apologize. Yes, please share.
I just was going to share very quickly, Mario. I appreciate the challenge that you may face in having conversations with colleagues who may not be used to this pronoun preference, but I think a way to kind of help them get on board is to acknowledge that faculty who have like what appears to be like a more obvious identity as a woman have been dealing with this kind of situation for many years, long before the open conversations about pronoun preferences ever really emerged in our conversations. And I think, appealing to what it means to have someone assume something about your gender identity just based off your name or based on how you look. I still get a gut punch when I get an email sent to me addressed to Dear Sir. I mean, and so, these salutations along with gender use of pronouns, it's all kind of in that same sort of category about people just too boldly making assumptions about you and not, taking the opportunity to get to know you before they decide how, they should go about addressing you. So just a thought that might be an example that you could share of how these kinds of things have been around for a long time. It's not just like, a politically savvy thing now that we're talking about.
No, I understand. That's a great example. Thank you.
Seriously, that very well said. Thank you for sharing your experience. And yeah, there's some text in the chat too, I think is really important to read. And all of these things are very important to listen to, because we have, even within this room, we clearly have a diversity of experience. And I think that's something that we can be grateful for today in listening to these different perspectives. And so there's a lot of, I think, good conversation going on in the chat too. I don't want to cut anything short, but let's maybe move on to the next scenario. Thanks again for sharing. And hopefully we can get some time to come back to the main room and share back after the scenario, okay? So we can open up the breakout rooms again, I think, and I will see you on the other side. Good luck. Okay, so hopefully there was some good conversation about this scenario as well. I know my room, we were talking right to the end, someone got cut off, so apologies to ECEDHA for that. So I'm again going to open the floor and ask people to share what they talked about, if you feel comfortable.
I'll open it up. This is.
I think I might have gotten muted shortly after.
Sorry, Kieran. Sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Getting fast with the buttons there. Okay.
I know how it goes. Thanks.
So I have a couple comments that I would make on this particular scenario, and I think we all had fun. So I work at the University of Arizona, and I'm an associate dean, and we do faculty hiring and inclusion. So that just trains conversation. So I would try to avoid even having this conversation in the first place. And the way we would do that is when we start crafting our hiring ads, at that same time, we would be crafting the criteria at which we rank the candidates. And towards the very end of our conversation, we talked about having weightings for different areas. And that would be before anybody even applies, is identifying some objective criteria at which we rate the candidates from. And actually, for all of us here in ECE, this is a great crowd. All of our hires, or all of our hiring pools, are very, very large. So having that objective criteria actually is a very great way to kind of to break down. So that's one thing. And then Shayla, we'll get to. And then the second thing is on this particular conversation. So if I were in this conversation, what I would do is I would acknowledge John and just give him a confirmation on, okay. But then with Marie, I would specifically ask her or him, okay, I would ask, him or her, have them unpack give some little rationale on why they're thinking this. Is it a gut, or can they start giving some quantitative criteria? And then are we holding all of our candidates to that similar criteria? So that's where I would answer, if that helps everybody.
I think that probably does help a lot of people. Thank you so much for sharing, Kathleen. Again, this is a theme, right? Setting these clear and consistent expectations before the process begins is really, again, one of the best tools we have, I think, to making things equitable. It's not necessarily easy to do, and we had conversations in my room about just getting a whole department to agree on something. So other thoughts? Anyone from my room want to share? No pressure, or other rooms?
Hi, Jean-François from ETS Montreal. So in our room, we, according to what John is saying, that we haven't had any good hires from that university. So the university is not part of the criteria so is it really a good way of seeing that that candidate? So we have to analyze his research and his document, whatever from which university is coming from. So at this point of the process,
So, Kieran, did you want to say something? Because actually at the end, Miguel, I think you were trying to say this at the end of our group is, let's pretend we have a candidate who actually is strong in the DEI area, and so that's like a strength of them. One thing I know about hiring that we have to be a little mindful of is if we didn't put it in our job description, we need to be a little mindful that maybe somebody who would have applied, I have a son sneezing, sorry. Maybe somebody would have applied. So that's where I try to get out to our hiring committees very, very early to make sure that they're very strategic on how they are going to put out their hiring ads, because everybody wants to get out their hiring ads. We're all in the same, they want to get them into the ad cycle. But then you spend a lot of time on, I call it the back end, trying to analyze all those 200 applicants. So if it turns out that we do want a candidate in the DEI area, then we need to make sure that we craft that correctly in our ads.
Great insight. Yeah, that's something that, you know, from the other side of things, the organizational side of things, it's important to make sure that the system, the structure is set up to clearly benefit and acknowledge and value this DEI work.
I think it's important that at least we have meetings with our hiring committees, and we try to have discussions that address the issue of, we want candidates who will contribute to our mission. I mean, and they could be great researchers, but they may not be people who can contribute to what our institution and our department wants to accomplish. So that's an important discussion. So, I mean, the issue of research, yeah, in this case will be important, that Marie, but it's not the only criteria that we will look into selecting a particular candidate.
So I want to share some good news on the horizon, and that is supportive of all of this discussion. So I get to see hires in all of our disciplines, which is a fun seat in the house to be. And we just had an interview yesterday with somebody who's doing traffic management. They're in our civil engineering area, and their research is embedded an equity-minded approach towards this. And I'm just thrilled because it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be equity, you know, sprinkled on at the last minute. And I'm just, we also had another individual, it was another department, and he was great because he really grilled our own dean about the DEI initiatives. I mean, so we have some great folks that are younger folks that are coming up the pipeline, that this is part of their they're living this like we are, but more than we are, and they're embracing it wholeheartedly.
That is, I think that's definitely encouraging and makes us, you know, all feel a little bit better. We have some, you know, I encourage you, if you don't have the chat open, please open that and see, because we have some great thoughts in the chat. One really important point, again, brought up by Shayla, so thank you, is that, you know, it's not just the hiring, right? It's the promotion and the track that these people are on. And in some of our other presentations, we go into a little bit more about these kind of glass ceilings for certain populations within the trajectory of upper management and things like that. And so you might have good representation at lower levels, right? But they don't make it to the upper levels. And so that's a very quick, I'm not doing the whole concept justice, but it's important to remind ourselves that, you know, the work doesn't stop at hiring, promotion, and you know, getting these people who are doing the work, getting them recognition in multiple ways is really important. So thank you so much for these. These are great contributions. Any other thoughts? So after this, we're going to kind of wrap up, but I want to give everyone a chance to contribute to this conversation because it's a good one.
I think this is Mohammed Shawik, a slight diversion from this. This is obviously this committee, and that's and I'm assuming that I don't have that. They had no prior work or collaboration with these universities, so-called the DEI universities. In other words, and I'm from an HBCU, I'm focusing on how the way the so-called primer classes, the big name universities, it seems they don't have any interest in HBCU. The interest is in skin color or whether it is a female or so, and nothing else. And that's why she's mentioning, Marie, I'm saying she, that lowering the bar. So there is a lot of assumption there. And when you want to hire people for diversity and so on, and from school like that, I think first and foremost, you need to get a relation with this university, know the culture, and therefore you know what they are bringing beside the research, what they are bringing there. For example, a professor like myself, we teach typically 3-4 courses a semester. And then we need to hire and we need to support students and so on and so forth. And that makes it hard even for the student to do, forget the infrastructure and everything else. And so if you as a big university so-called, and you want to really hire faculty from HBCU, why don't you start having a sort of collaboration first? And then get to the hire, and it will be more automatic than this nonsense talk like that. Anyway, I'm gonna stop here. I know Ken is laughing probably. He said he's gonna talk forever.
Well, Mohammed, I just want to applaud what you have to say, because at Arizona, at the University of Arizona, we're teaming with an HBCU in Florida to do some of this, and it's coming from the higher ups. I'm not trying to say we have all the solutions, but and then I just want to mention one more thing. I'll just quote a book, but in Michelle Obama's book, she mentions how she was at the law firm and they were all hiring people from the same 3 or 4 Ivy League schools, and she really pushed an initiative for the broad pool. So but I also I heard something very important you said is, don't just reach out when you need somebody, develop that relationship over the long term and the mutual.
And Kathleen, there is another thing, if I may, just one more thing here. I talk to colleagues and they keep telling me something that is, I'm sorry to say, so stupid. They say we cannot find them. We cannot find Black professor or female or so. Are you looking at the right place?
That is so not true. And yeah, absolutely. Actually, what I want to do is I want to take a sabbatical. Actually, my dream I was thinking about was take a sabbatical semester or a year and actually go see if I could teach at an HBCU and just walk the experience.
Amen to that. Now, let's talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to applaud. Yeah, all of the contributions. This is another great point. It is not neglecting these relationships, and only in the interest of time, I just want to close this. But I just want to take the time to thank everyone for participating, and this means a lot to us, and I think it helps a lot of people here. So your words mean a lot. Just moving on to talk about some action items. So we've talked about the concepts, we've gone through some scenarios. Make a personal commitment to action. This list is not exhaustive. Many ideas have come up in this conversation today that I think should help you. But set goals to reduce bias. So engage, join groups that tackle these issues and really are thinking about these issues regularly, and thinking about our own bias and addressing that and constantly learning, as Agnieszka mentioned. Go outside of your comfort zone, read outside of your wheelhouse. The idea of diversity applies to ideas as well as people. And so recognize your position of power and the fact that you can oftentimes start these conversations, right? Oftentimes it's on these people in positions of power to normalize the conversations about DEI, whether you're running a lab or amongst your peers. Recognize that it takes action. And so when you see something like this happen in a scenario, be prepared to speak up, practice what you would say, directly intervene, be an ally and discuss with other bystanders how you could maybe have handled it differently in the next time it happens. Again, just more normalize the conversation. So talk with your peers about unconscious bias, encourage others to attend workshops like this or things that may be offered at your university, and do outreach. These are all things that we do as well, is outreach and joining a group, wearing a pin. Every little action you can take in your life to make this more of a daily work that we can do is going to help. And obviously this is a group of people who are very high up in their departments, and so you all are very successful, and a lot of the students look up to you. And so it's something that you can do is make a departmental commitment to action. So you can, like we said, try and foster relationships with HBCUs, establish workshops, and value and reward diversity work. So take this, find ways to quantify the impact of DEI work in admissions, weighting, things like that. Establish standards within the department and training for admissions committees. So, make sure that everyone is on the same page and set those clear and consistent expectations in scenarios where this bias might come into play, which is most scenarios, right, in terms of these day-to-day interactions in the departments. And it's more of the same, right, but just on a departmental level. Recognize the extent of your power and what you can do to change things, and discuss with your peers. So, here are maybe some conversation topics that you can use if you're trying to figure out what do I even talk about. So hopefully you all have the slides. Maybe we can put them in the chat one more time so you can download a copy, and you can use this as kind of a starting point for some of these discussions. Okay. So the last thing and most important thing is thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention and your participation. This is really important work, and we value this interaction and the input and feedback from you all more than you know. This is our website. We do workshops, and we can schedule workshops. If you're interested, you can reach out to us. And yeah, I'll just end there. So thanks to all my fellow bias busters and to all the conference organizers for putting this on. It's been great.
Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate the presentation. I think we all learned a lot. We all had good discussions. So thank you again, and do reach out to them. They're amazing. I have to say that at Seattle University, I took their example and I just established DEI student ambassadors, and they're doing workshops in classrooms. They're doing town halls to see how everybody's doing. So take example. Do a small action or a large action. So thank you again. And I will pass it to John, I guess, to tell us what's next. Oh, Susan, I'm not sure who's.
Well, let me say one thing. We had scheduled the Bias Busters to be with us at the annual conference, and unfortunately, we were unable to get together in person. But I think I speak for everyone to say when we do have that opportunity, we'd love to have you come and join the group in person, because I think the work you're doing is spectacular, and I think there is the ECEDHA organization influences so many people and we touch so many lives, and I think we can help support your efforts. So we would welcome you to be part of our group when we get together again.